Hello. My name is Tony Haigh. I'm the retired professor of theatre here at Centre College. And I'm standing in Whittaker Theatre, an empty theatre. Nothing sadder than an empty theatre. But one day all these seats will be filled again, and we'll be able to go and enjoy ourselves and travel, and we won't need all this stuff anymore. So let's imagine that we could travel to London, and London will be full of tourists, and you want to walk in the footsteps of Shakespeare. How would you do that? Well, firstly, let's look at how London looked in 1616. What you're seeing is what is called Vischer's long view of London. And if you look at the top left-hand corner, you'll see St. Paul's Cathedral. It's in the old Gothic style, before it was burnt down by the Great Fire of London. And in the bottom right, you'll see what is now Southwark Cathedral, and London Bridge, crossing over from the main road from the south into London, into the City of London. And then on the south bank, you'll see two important theatres, one called the Bear Garden and the other called the Globe. We actually think they were labelled the wrong way round, but that was Vischer's problem, not ours. But it shows us the classic wooden O view of an Elizabethan Jacobean theatre. This is a close-up of that, and we can clearly see the two theatres on the bottom of the image. This is what it looks like today. Quite different. Now, the City of London, as we know it, is actually made up of two cities. The City of London and the City of Westminster. And what we're looking at in this image is the City of London, starting on the bottom right with the Tower of London, and then going all the way around Holborn High Street, coming down again to the Thames, and we can see this, this very controlled, very tight-knit community of the city. The other city was the City of Westminster, which is round the bend of the river, and that was where the King was, where now Parliament is, and Buckingham Palace, and all the things we think of as London are actually in the City of Westminster. But we call the whole thing now Greater London. Some of the other places we're going to talk about, if we look between the A and the M, we look to the north bank of the river, we can see the Blackfriars Landing, and we're going to talk about that a little later on. This is what it looks like today. Here we see London Bridge, which is the 1, 2, 3, 4th bridge. The 5th bridge along is it's called the Wobbly Bridge, and you can see it's pointed at Wren's St. Paul's Cathedral and coming from the Tate Modern. Because theatre was banned in the city, Shakespeare and others like him were forced to work outside the city boundaries. And James Burbage built a building up in the district of Shoreditch, which he called the theatre, the first purpose-built theatre built in England since Roman times. What else is he going to call it? It was sited in the old Holywell Priory. And you can see on this image where we think it roughly was. There's a street called Curtain Street, which becomes very important. So when you're going, look on your A to Z map of London and find Curtain Street and walk down Curtain Street, and you'll be in the right area. And then you'll see a plaque on one of the buildings on Curtain Street that says that this part of London was in the precinct of the Priory of St. John the Baptist and Holywell, and there in 1577 the first theatre building existed. In fact, where that plaque is in the wrong place again. There were two theatres in this district at the time. One was called the Curtain and the other was called the Theatre. And excavations have gone on both sites now and produced some really kind of interesting stuff. You can see Sir Ian McKellen pointing at a hole in the ground because, you know, archaeologists like posh people to poke at the hole in the ground. This is the street where we now know the curtain was. Some of the finds there have been really interesting. If you look on the lower right of this picture, you'll see a sort of ceramic box. So when you went to the theatre, you paid a penny to go in, and there'd be a gatekeeper there who when you put your penny into this ceramic box, which has no lid, and you would then go into the yard and stand and watch the play. If you wanted a seat, there was another gatekeeper who you'd give another penny to, and he would let you into a seat. If you wanted to go to the posh seats higher up, there's another gatekeeper, you give him a penny. And these boxes were then collected when the performance started and taken to the box office. Yeah. Where they were smashed. Now they're complete ceramic to stop the gatekeeper from pilfering from the takings. So when they're smashed, the money's taken out. So one of the things you find on these sites of Elizabethan theatres are lots of shards of pottery. And there you see the happy hands of an archaeologist showing you a pile of shards, which archaeologists love that kind of stuff. So the theatre was up there, and the curtain. We know very little about the curtain at the time. This is an engraving thought to be of the curtain, and we see a building that looks quite like what we're expecting an Elizabethan theatre to look like, and the flags flying. One of the fun things to see is that it's rural. What is now one of the busiest parts of London was then fields. And we've started digging up on both the theatre site and on the curtain site. And one of the really interesting things we found at the curtain is that the stage was 14 meters long and rectangular. And the curtain was built against a set of tenement buildings. So we think that the curtain might have been rectangular. Now this is really strange, right? There's also a tunnel running underneath the stage of the curtain where actors could get from one side of the stage to the other. It's 14 meters long, which is great for fight scenes. In fact, fencing piste is 14 meters long. Coincidence? I don't think so. This changes our thinking about what theatres looked like. We're so used to having this polygonal, circular, wooden O building that Shakespeare talks about. But there are other pieces of evidence out there which we sort of kind of skate over because they don't fit that picture. There's a thing called the Hope Contract, which is a contract to build the Hope Theatre. And in the contract, it says to be built every way like the globe, except that the drawings for that building are rectangular. And we've always kind of fussed about that. How we've got a square building and a circular middle inside. What does that look like? We don't know. But once we start thinking that there were many different forms of stage available in Elizabethan times, in all kinds of places, then we can open our minds a little wider. Now, where they're excavating this, one of the earliest excavations was of the Rose Theatre, and that was in the late 1980s, early 90s. And the developers of that site, who were building an office building, wanted to let people excavate it, and then they were going to go pour concrete all over it, and it ended up with Judi Dench lying in front of a bulldozer trying to stop them filling up this space. So it's been really kind of tricky. The developers of this site have seen the excavations as an advantage, and in fact are building a whole new development that is going to have offices and apartments and a museum and access to the site, and the whole complex is called The Stage, and it should be open by the time you go to London. Another interesting find that was there was what this archaeologist is holding, and it's a bird call, a little ceramic bird whistle. You may have seen these. You put a little water in it and you blow through a tube and it bubbles and makes a sound. Romeo and Juliet. 'Tis the nightingale, not the lark. And we know that Romeo and Juliet was first performed at the Curtain, as was Henry V. But it's in Henry V we get the line about the wooden O. But we think that that line was inserted when they moved to the Globe later on. More pictures of the excavation. This would be the entranceway. Some interesting finds. Clay pipes. People were smoking. Lots of the nubs, the top of the boxes where the money was put, a comb, and this really fascinating little ivory carving of a drunken man straddling a beer barrel. No one knows quite what it was all about, whether it was an amulet or a little pocket ornament, and half of it's missing, so that's caused some interest in the artistic community. And this is what the projected site of the stage, we hope, will look like, with access to the theatre underneath. I find it quite really interesting that the theatre was originally against a tenement building, and now it's against a tenement building with apartments, with shops at the lower level and offices, and a kind of multi-use. So it's going to be great to live there, I think. It's going to be quite interesting. So now we have, if we went in that area where the Globe and the theatre were, the church there is St Leonard's Church. Now, the building that we see today dates from about 1740. So it's a classical remake on the Saxon church that originally stood there. If any of you have seen the TV series The Rev, that's the church that's used there, and this church has been used in several episodes of Luther, for those of you who are addicted to British television. And it's a wonderful church, and I hope that the first time I went there to do some investigation, it was really derelict. There were homeless people and living in the bushes around it. The plaster was falling off the walls. It was really in terrible state. And I hope that having had use for television over the past 20 years or so, that they've used that money to repair it. Well, this was the church that a lot of the actors went to. And there is a plaque in there that tells us this. That buried here are a number of leading actors from England. James Burbage, the father, his sons, Richard, who was the first actor to play Hamlet, his brother Cuthbert, who was sort of the business manager of the enterprise, Will Summers, who was Henry VIII's Jester, Richard Tarleton, one of the leading actors of the day. And if you look down at the bottom, you can see an actor called Gabriel Spencer. Gabriel Spencer is notorious for having been murdered by Ben Jonson in a duel. Ben Jonson got away with that murder because he claimed that he was a clergyman because he could read and write. And so he was acquitted because he would have to be tried in the ecclesiastical court as a clergyman, but as he wasn't ordained, they couldn't try him anyway, so he actually got away with that murder. I asked when I went there, could I see where the graves of all these great actors are? And they said, well, actually you can't get in the basement because it's sealed, because there are plague victims in there, and we don't know quite how dangerous it will be. Well, since that time, it's been cleared for public access, and if you ask nicely, you might be able to be taken on a guided tour down there by the sexton with there's no visible graves there. There's just piles and piles of rotted coffins and bones, as you can see in the lower picture there. So it's not a very kind of tasteful place. The only nice one is the one that was in the previous image, which is supposed to be of a Hungarian princess. But what she was doing, being buried in St Leonard's Church, I'm not quite sure. She was married to, I think, a goldsmith who lived in London. Now, when you're in the square there, go and catch the 149 bus that will take you to London Bridge, the main entry into London from the south at the time. Now, when you're there, and you get off the bus, you're on Southwark High Street, and you're going to look for an entryway that's going to lead into a pub called the George Inn, which is the last remaining inn from that period. One of the most famous ones of the inns on that, you've got to think, you're coming into London by horse, by carriage, or on foot, and you don't want to spend London prices once you cross the bridge, so you're going to stay the night on the south bank of the city, where it's a little cheaper, before you go into London to do your business. There were lots of inns on that road where you could do this. One of the most famous was the Talbot, which in 1388 had a gathering of pilgrims going to Canterbury that Chaucer wrote about in his Canterbury Tales. But the only surviving one now is the George, and not all of it survives. It's been taken over by the National Trust so that it's preserved, but only 1/3 of it is preserved. If you think about what you're looking at now with the galleries, think about that on 3 sides. 2 sides have now gone and were demolished for the railways when the London Bridge Railway was put in. But we see here the galleries. In Elizabethan times, the ground level, which is now where the bars are, would have been for stabling horses. The upper level for drinks, and the next level up would be if you were staying the night. So you think about the hierarchy of people who slept in the stables, people who went there to drink, and people who went there to stay the night in a kind of social hierarchy. And you think about when the actors were building theatres for the first time, they were using this same model, that people stood in the yard, or they were in nice seats in a gallery, or even posher seats in a gallery above that. And this is the idea that Burbage took with him into the theatre when he first built it, so that we have these galleries. And the beer's really good there too, so you might enjoy that. So there's the George Inn, which I mentioned before is close to Southwark Cathedral. Now, we know that Shakespeare didn't attend Southwark Cathedral, but there are lots of references to Shakespeare in that area and in the church itself. There's a really nice statue, a carving of a reclining Shakespeare in alabaster in the church, and in his hand every day somebody puts a sprig of rosemary, echoing the line, Ophelia's line in Hamlet, "Here's rosemary for remembrance." There's also stained glass windows of the various plays that Shakespeare wrote, which is kind of well worth going to. And it's a really beautiful church, so it's a nice time to spend some time. Also close by the Southwark Cathedral is Borough Market, and one of the ancient markets of London, which has now become the foodie centre of London. If you want to eat and eat well, or buy food for a picnic, Borough Market is where you want to go. It's been there for centuries, and it's just amazing. And you'll sort of eat yourself silly if you haven't had lunch at the George Inn across the road and a couple of pints there. There's a really good fish and chip shop in Borough Market too, which I really like. So Borough Market, so in this area then of London Bridge, we're going to be looking at Borough Market, George Inn, and Southwark Cathedral. They're really quite interesting. But now we're getting to the kind of fun stuff. It's where the Globe was. And we know that it was this polygonal building with galleries and a thrust stage that came out, behind which was a front scanai, or a sort of scenic backdrop, which had 2 side doors and a large central opening and galleries above for musicians and really posh people who wanted to sit and look down at the actors. For years, we didn't know where the site of the Globe was. And this was an area of London that was heavily bombed during World War II. So there was a building where we thought it should be, that had been demolished and was now just a car park. Was basically just bulldozed rubble flat. There was a car park next to some historic buildings. And the archaeologists went in there and they had these porter cabin temporary offices which they parked in one corner of the site and then started digging all over the site and found nothing. Very sadly, they then picked up the Canadian Shakespeare Society actually put a plaque on the wall that said somewhere near here was the Globe, and that's about as far as we go. And if you can see on the bottom right hand of this picture, there's the plaque that they put up. Anyway, when the archaeologists gave up, took their portable office, cleared out, and they started digging where the portable office was, it was under their feet all the time. Now, because there is a historic building that's already listed, an 18th century building on that site over where the Globe was, we can't fully excavate that. So what they've done in the courtyard of that, they've outlined in slate with carvings of letters the circumference of the Globe. So you can actually see where the Globe was physically. So we got the Globe all in this area. And then there's the Rose Theatre, which was one of the first Elizabethan theatres to be fully excavated. One of the fun things about the Rose is that they were often in competition with the Globe, where Shakespeare and his compadres were performing. So when the line "arose by any other name would smell as sweet," the audience would laugh because the Rose Theatre next door was notoriously smelly because the sewer ran underneath it. So that was an in-joke at the time, which people kind of found really kind of amusing. So the Rose has been excavated, and it has actually been preserved. And now, if you look at the top left image, you'll see an entranceway into what you can see, but it's not open all the time, and it's quite hard to get into. And they've stabilized some of it for you to see. Next door to it, that little tiny door just by the bridge there, which is the railway line going into London Bridge Station, there is a theatre, and they do Elizabethan era plays there. Their main repertoire are kind of interesting and lost pieces from the Elizabethan era. So if you get an opportunity to go down to the actual Rose Theatre to see a play, it's right next door to where the excavations were. So now we've got all these bits of pieces. Oh, and there's the Bear Garden, famous for a bear baiting site, which was there. There's now a street going up the side of the reconstructed Globe called the Bear Garden. And if you go slightly beyond where those road barriers are, there's an open space. And if you look carefully at the cobbles on the street, you'll see that they're actually aligned on the pattern of the bear garden, the bear baiting arena that was there. In fact, I got a photograph from a former student of mine the other day who'd been told by another former student, Dan Gaber, who lives in London, about there, and they sent me a photograph of them standing on those cobbles saying, "Look, Dan Gaber told us that you told him that we could come here and see the Bear Garden," and that's actually true. At the top of Bear Garden Street on the riverside, you'll see indented into the wall this strange, of a modern building, this strange kind of nook. What that was a ferryman's seat. Because at that time, you could either pay a toll to go across the river on the bridge, or you could hire a ferryman to take you across. Now, the ferryman would pay you one, if you had It's like a taxi, one person in a taxi is expensive, 3 people in a taxi is a lot cheaper. So if 3 or 4 of you wanted to go across the river, take a boat and a guy would row you across, and that would be a little cheaper. There's a very famous story of actors getting into a fight with the ferryman over the fare and actually being arrested for brawling in the streets with a ferryman. But that little seed is there. No one knows what it is. There's no plaque on it, but look out for it when you'll see it when it's there. So there's the bear garden. And then there's the new globe. Sam Wanamaker, who's an American actor who was blacklisted during the McCarthy eras, was in exile in London and looked around and said, well, where's the globe? Where's all the Shakespeare stuff? And people went, we haven't actually got any. So he set about to make his life's work to build a reconstructed globe, roughly in the area where the globe stood. Now he's right now on the riverbank with the reconstructed globe, which is possible because the river is now embanked. In Shakespeare's time, the river wouldn't have been embanked, so the floodwaters would come up to where the theatre was, which is 2 streets away, 2 blocks away from the river. So the reconstructed globe is there. They built it over. It took a long time to build and to raise the money, and lots of actors helped out. A good friend of mine, an actor called Robert Lister, who lives in Stratford, who some of you may have met if you've travelled with me, Uncle Bob, he drove the minibus on one of our tours of theatres in England. So if you're one out of that group, you'll remember Uncle Bob. Who worked with Sam Wanamaker, who is now buried, we think, under the stage of the globe. They decided that the historical reconstructions of the globe were so different. Each theatre historian came up with a different theory of what they looked like. So over the years, when it first opened, for about 3 or 4 seasons, they were experimental, and the stage placement and what was on the stage and where the pillars, the columns were that held up the roof that we knew that was there, were tried out in different configurations, and then all the actors and the directors would get together and say, what worked, what didn't work, what was it like from a practical point of view. And it took them 3 or 4 goes to come up with what they thought was historically accurate and was practical from an acting point of view. You don't want to put columns holding a roof up downstage where you're blocking your way from half the audience, and you have to kind of work around the pillars. So you've got to pull the columns back, cantilever out a little bit, hold that roof over the stage to keep the actors dry. You can still stand in the pit. They thought it held 2,000 or 3,000 people. Now it doesn't, just because health and safety doesn't let us, not to mention social distancing. But we can't get to that point. There's a wonderful story of we call the people who stood in the pit, we call them groundlings. There's a wonderful story of the Venetian ambassador visiting London and saying, "No, I want to stand down there. That looks like fun." So rather than being in the Lord's room and the big seats, he went down, but he actually got beaten up because they heard him speaking Italian and thought it was Spanish and thought he was a Spanish spy, so he had to kind of make an escape. Little notorious story there. But if you go, here's a little tip, if you go with a group of people to the Globe to see a production, and productions will start in May-ish in a normal year, because you're going to do it in the summertime. Buy half your tickets for the groundlings and half in seats, and then switch over at intermission. So you get to experience both watching from a gallery and watching from the crowd. Because depending on how long a play is, if you might be standing for 4 hours watching Hamlet, that may not be a best idea. At least you can switch over and get a seat for half of that. I've seen a number of productions there, and they've really been very interesting. But it's not It's not a museum piece. It's a working theatre. And actors and directors will interpret plays in the ways they want to, but just in that kind of space. And I think that's important, not to see it as a kind of place where so-called authentic theatrical productions were performed. Just on one little point, you can make the space authentic, you can make your acting style authentic, you can even speak in authentic Elizabethan English, but the audience will never be authentic. Because to Shakespeare's audience, this would be the first time they'd ever seen these plays or heard them. So it's never going to be authentic. And anybody who tells you it is, tell them to get away, go away. So now we've got the new globe, which is kind of really exciting. The same year, 1576, that Shakespeare built the theatre, and incidentally, they left the theatre because they were having problems paying the rent. Shakespeare had borrowed, Burbage had borrowed money from his brother-in-law, and that didn't go well, and the curtain and the theatre were exchanging theatre companies, and various theatre companies were using it. And eventually they got, there's a wonderful apocryphal story of his brother-in-law's widow coming to collect the rent and get her money back, and Burbage saying, oh, come back tomorrow. And when she came back tomorrow, there was just a hole in the ground because they dismantled the theatre, taken it south of the river and rebuilt it. That, I think, is not true, because it would be hard to do. But I do think that some of the timbers from the theatre were reused in building the globe, which was actually built and rebuilt. It was built in 1606 and then had a rebuilt in 1619 when the first one burnt down. But the same year that he built the theatre, he also leased property in the old Blackfriars Monastery. Now, if you remember, Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, so the monasteries became crown land, not part of the City of London. And as crown land, they were exempt from the rules of no theatre performances in the city. Henry VIII used these monasteries as gifts to folks. Okay, I'm going to take over. I'm going to now be the Church of England, and all the monasteries are now mine. Thank you very much. So if you're Lord so-and-so and you've been very good to me, here's a monastery. Go, or here's an abbey. Have a bit of land and go do something with it. It was a way that the king could gift the people he needed to keep on his side without actually costing him anything. So the old Blackfriars Monastery was at one point owned by Lord Hudson, who was master of the King's Revels. And anyway, so Burbage leased part of that, but the local inhabitants complained that parking was an issue, and if we had the nobles coming down with their carriages, there was nowhere to put them. So it got sort of, they put off for several years actually using that space. It had been used as a parliament building. Parliament had met there. And there was a great hall called the Parliament Hall, which was used. There was the Porter's Lodge. There were several parts of that precinct that became used for theatrical purposes. And eventually, Burbage's company, which Shakespeare was a sharer, moved into the Blackfriars, and that became their winter performance space. So they then had two performance spaces, summer, spring and fall, not high summer because the plague was always a problem, would be seasons where they performed in the Globe. In the winter, at the Blackfriars, and in the summer, they'd go on tour. They'd leave the City of London, which was kind of festering and smelly and horrible, and go and perform in various lords' houses and earn what money they could. We know very little about what the Blackfriars Theatre looked like. There was the first Blackfriars Theatre, second Blackfriars Theatre. We know there are some designs for what become known as private playhouses, We know that it was 6 times more expensive to gain entry. So the audience would have been a more aristocratic audience, a more upper-class audience. So basic entry into the Globe was a penny. Basic entry into the Blackfriars was 6pence. Now, the second phase of building of the reconstructed Globe is to open a Blackfriars replica, which is nicely named the Sam Wanamaker Theatre. So I haven't seen productions there. I've seen productions that have come from there into a London theatre and been reconstructed in the same way, which is kind of really exciting. One of the things about Blackfriars performances was that the place was lit by candles. And in those days, candles were not highly efficient. And once the wicks got to a certain length, they became all smoky and foul, and you'd have to trim them. So the candelabra would have to come down from the ceiling, wicks trimmed, and hoisted back up again every half hour or so, 20 minutes, half hour or so. So in some of those Shakespeare plays from that period that were designed in that space, that's where you get the song. So when there are songs in Shakespeare, it's usually because somebody's trimming the wicks on the candles and the play is paused for a little while whilst the whole thing kind of moves on. All there is now is the Blackfriars pub, which is roughly on the site of the old Blackfriars Monastery. There's Blackfriars Bridge there, and the site of where the theatre was is near where this building is on the right hand of your screen. There were several Jacobean playhouses in this district: the Cockpit and Court, the Salisbury Playhouse, a whole bunch of others that were all in this area of London. We do know that Shakespeare did attend St. Helen's Church there on Bishopsgate. We do know that because he didn't pay his taxes. And he's actually fined for tax evasion in the rolls of St. Helen's Church. And he rented property, or he actually bought property in that district. And the right-hand picture is on Bishopsgate, and just beyond that tower is where we think Shakespeare had lodgings. Did he live there? There's some question about whether he actually lived in that area, because he then bought the building and then rented it back out again to the occupant. So I think it was probably an investment. He became a very shrewd businessman because he was getting paid for the plays, he was getting paid as an actor, he had shares in the company and he was getting paid as a sharer, and he was getting paid for everything else, and he was investing money in land. So when he retires and goes to live in Stratford, he can buy the second biggest house in Stratford for his own and Anne's use. So there's the Blackfriars pub, and we go there and we think this is really kind of exciting. If we then move along the river, we're going to look at Middle Temple Hall. If you think about the city, as we thought about it, London Bridge and Tower Bridge is at one end, London Bridge is kind of in the middle, and Blackfriars Bridge is on the other extreme of the city. Edward III, who formed Oxford and Cambridge universities, decreed that all higher education should be done in his universities. Now, if you became a lawyer, you became a pupil of a lawyer for a period of time before you'd be called to the bar. So those institutions that were training lawyers couldn't be in the city. So they moved to the west of the city. So the area immediately west of the City of London is the legal district, where the Old Bailey is and all the barristers' chambers. I say barristers because they're the guys that try cases. Solicitors are the one who prepare them and would do general legal work. But all the barristers are in chambers in what are called the Inns of Court. There's Lincoln's Inn, Temple, Gray's Inn, and Middle Temple. Now the temples were land that was once owned by the Knights Templar, who were banished by the Pope, and the Catholic Church took over their land, and when Henry VIII took over the monasteries, he gained access to the temples, and that area of land became under the jurisdiction of a group of lawyers. So collectives of lawyers are called the Inns of Court. Now, if there's any, I always wondered if getting called to the bar meant you were good enough. Hey, come over here, lad. Come and have a drink at the bar. Now you're one of us. I don't. It's a good story. But Middle Temple Hall is one of the oldest surviving medieval halls in London. It's got a beautiful vaulted hammer beam roof, a buttery screen at one end, which was typical of great halls, which coincidentally had a gallery where musicians were halfway up, and a large central opening, two small side openings, and where the food would be brought in without the smoke and the rain from the outside. Yours one of the kitchens not in the building, because kitchens caught fire. So you always carried the food from the kitchen to the Great Hall for the big banquet. And lawyers, trainee lawyers, barristers would be required to attend several dinners a year. That would be their requirement, as well as being a pupil of a barrister. And there'd be, where you've got a bunch of students, you've got entertainment. And they often called for the Globe Company, which was just across the river, to travel over to them and perform plays. And we do know that the first performance of Twelfth Night was on Twelfth Night, I think 1606, in Middle Temple Hall. So Twelfth Night was performed on Twelfth Night for this aristocratic bunch of lawyers who would find the fun poked at Malvolio really quite their taste, and they knew exactly who Malvolio was being lampooned. I was very fortunate one year when I was in London with a group of students, when the 400th anniversary of the first performance of Twelfth Night was performed in Middle Temple Hall by the Globe Company, an all-male company. I managed to get tickets for my student group that I was with to see that. So if you're one of the students who were in Middle Temple Hall for that anniversary performance, you were in a special location at that time, my friend. So Middle Temple Hall, it's often open to the public, and sometimes you just have to ask nicely, and you can get in to look at it. But it's really kind of quite special. So now we've got Blackfriars, we've got Middle Temple Hall, and we're going to now move into the city of Westminster, and we're going to look at the Banqueting Hall, which is in Whitehall. This building was the third building built for, it was a kind of party house. But James I ordered it built, still in the reign of Shakespeare, at the time of Shakespeare. He ordered it built. Ben Jonson was the chief presenter of entertainments there. Inigo Jones was the scenic designer who made these fabulous sets and costumes there, and he was also an architect. And eventually, there are two buildings built on this site under the reign of James I, and then Charles I, his son, was brought to build a new building. And Inigo Jones, who was the court architect, if you like, had been to Italy and studied Palladian architecture, so built this essentially Palladian building, which is the only surviving building of the original Palace of Westminster. So this is it, and it's actually brilliant. And those of you who remember, who've been in humanities with me, will remember we talk about the double cube being the classical proportions for a building and a room in the Palladian style, in the neoclassic style. And here we have the great throne room of Middle Temple Hall. The ceiling is painted by Rubens. And I think there are 7 panels, 7 individual panels painted on canvas on the ceiling. And it's one of the few places where a Rubens painting is in situ where it was meant to be. Unfortunately, they had to stop performing in there because candles again. That the smoke from the candles was damaging the paintings on the ceiling. But this was basically Charles I's party house, where you'd have great balls, entertainments, masques, entertaining foreign visitors and dignitaries. It would be a wonderful space for that. And it's halfway between, if you're going to look for it, it's halfway between Trafalgar Square and the Houses of Parliament on Westminster, facing Horse Guards Parade. And you see the Horse Guard there. There is an interesting centre connection to the Banqueting Hall, which is open to the public on a regular basis. When King Charles was executed by Oliver Cromwell, the scaffold was built outside of the banqueting house, which is a great insult. The part where his great profligacy was noted was the place where he was executed. And they built the scaffold up against the large windows of that main double cube room. The guard, the captain of the guard, or the colonel of the guard who guarded the king during his trial, was a Daniel Axtell, Colonel Daniel Axtell, who once Charles II was restored to the throne, he was arrested and executed, hung, drawn and quartered. Now his son, also a Daniel Axtell, fled with his family to the Carolinas, and hence gave us the Axtell line in America, and our own Rick Axtell, the college chaplain and great wonderful teacher, is a direct descendant of Daniel Axtell, who was there. So that's our trip around London. So go for a nice walkabout, you'll enjoy it. Shakespeare is visible in London if you know where to look. There's a wonderful book called Shakespeare's Theatreland by a friend of mine called Julian Bauscher, who was the chief architect on the Rose excavation. That's a really good book, and in the back of that book he has 4 or 5 walks that you can do in each of these kind of distinct areas. The problem is the whole excavations of the curtain and the theatre have happened since that book was published, and I think he's now in the process of rewriting that chapter because it's wrong. There's stuff we now know that we didn't know at that time. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this virtual travel around London, and thank you to Mackenzie for filming it, and I hope we'll meet you all again someday. Look me up, send me an email. God bless.